So hi, my name is Heidi McCullough, and I am a building specialist and energy consultant with CLEER and Garfield Clean Energy. And I would like to thank everybody for taking the time to join us for this informational meeting on the upcoming updates to the Town of Carbondale's Commercial Energy and Green Building Code. We have an hour to cover the material, and luckily it doesn't take quite that long, so our time, we should not run over unless we have more technical hijinks. We will try to take questions as they come up so they flow along with the material that they're relevant to. You should see in your screen a Q&A or question and answer button. It's easiest if folks submit their questions there. We do also have the chat screen open, so we can take questions through chat as well. So today, the information that we are going to cover, we're going to discuss the adoption of the 2018 International Green Construction Code, or the IGCC, by the Town of Carbondale. We're also going to go over a brief overview of the history of the environmental initiatives in Carbondale, as well as the community's climate goals and the plan to get there. Then eventually we're going to get to some of the recommendations for updates for this cycle of the code. And as you mentioned, there will be time for questions and input at the end, as well as an invite for you all to submit an input toward this process through email at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jeff Dickinson, who many of you probably already know. Jeff is a licensed architect and an energy consultant with Biospaces Energy Consulting. He has supported energy efficiency work in many ways around the region for over 30 years. Jeff also supports code development throughout the region and was key in the development of this code and this code language. So he is the best person to answer questions. So on that note, I'm going to pass it off to Jeff.
Great. Thank you, Heidi. I'll give you all basically an overview. Heidi gave the agenda. We're going to cover those items and basically going to get into some nuts and bolts, but it's mostly going to be kind of a broad overview, and you'll be able to access a lot of the details when you click on some of the links that we'll provide, or you may have already looked at those. They were in the invitation Maisa sent out. So basically a year ago, John Plano, the town's building official, chief building official, contacted me and said, okay, now we've gotten the residential code updated. Now it's time to work on the commercial code. We basically had adopted the International Green Construction Code back in 2013. We adopted the 2012 code. So now we're looking at updating it to the 2018 code. So basically what we do is we look at the code and we say, and we look at the town's climate action plan and we say, all right, what is feasible in our community and still supports the climate action plan? So we want to balance cost with logistics and, you know, the technical feasibility of doing those things. So we looked at it pretty hard. My associate Lorraine Elo and I have spent a lot of time comparing these different documents. We really looked back into that 2012 IGCC, and we did a really detailed review of the 2012, 2015, and then the 2018. So we've really studied those, and that's when you see that list. I think we call it the master list of amendments that we're making of each of the sections. We've gotten a lot of input on this. So like I said, John contacted us in back last summer. So we've had a year in the making to get here. So of course, John has given a lot of input. The Carbondale trustees have heard us a few times. The environmental board has given a lot of input. And we've gotten input from a lot of local organizations, including CLEER and CORE, and statewide organizations as well. The other thing we've done is looked at what's happening around the state. What's Denver doing, for example? What's Boulder doing? What's happening around the country? So there's a lot that's been happening on this front, a lot of changes since 2012. So right now we're in the next steps portion. We're gathering public input. That's where you all come in, and we've had a lot of good questions this morning, so we're going to be able to answer those. And then if you have any questions, just respond to that Q&A section. after we get input from everybody, we're going to revise the document based on that input and answer questions. And then we'll present to the trustees probably in August, and then hope for basically an adoption following soon after that in the fall. All right, so talk about basically the Carbondale Environmental Initiative history. So Carbondale has a long history of having green codes and advanced energy efficiency codes and that sort of thing, both for commercial and residential. And you know, since the late 80s, the Environmental Board was established, and we started looking at some of those codes. And then we adopted some green building codes in the mid 90s that were voluntary, getting people used to it. And then we started to step out a little bit and say, well, we're doing this. Why are we doing this? So really looking at the climate action plan and dovetailing all of our changes to the codes or adopting new codes that relate to that climate action plan. As I said, last year, we revised the residential efficient building program. And then in 2021, we're looking at adopting and revising the International Green Construction Code. So we're lockstep with what's happening as per plan. So what are those community climate goals? Basically, we have that climate and energy action plan, kind of the second bullet there, that was revised in 2017. And that really said that all buildings should be net zero by 2050. Well, 2050 is a long way out, right? So how are we going to get there? So one of the things we'll share later is this roadmap to getting to that net zero. So an important thing to note is we're really talking about new construction here. So we have a goal of 2030 for new construction to get to net zero. And it's going to take a lot of effort to get there with new construction. It's going to take even more effort to get to that 2050 goal, 100% for all construction, right? So it's all buildings. So we're going to be working on that. So one of the reasons you might see that the goal of 2030 seems a little advanced from 2050 is because it's really isolated on that new construction right now, new commercial construction. And just, the main point being that the majority of buildings that will exist in 2050 are already built. So it's really important that we focus on this new construction while we can. And then basically CLEER will be working on how to, plans to, increase the efficiency of existing buildings as they have been since their inception 10 years ago, 10 or more years ago. So net zero construction, the next slide, please. All right, so how do we define net zero? So basically, a net zero building is a building that annually produces as much energy as it consumes for the heating, water heating, cooling, and basic electrical loads, including lighting and plug loads and fans, that sort of thing. And a true net zero building is one that is not connected to gas infrastructure at all. We'll talk a little bit about the grid and the greening of the grid and what percentage of renewables are within the grid, whether you're in Excel territory or in Holy Cross territory. So we'll cover that a little bit. Well, what we've decided to do is separate building loads from process loads. So building loads are those loads that any building would use for heating, air conditioning, water heating, or lighting. Typical building loads. The process loads we're saying are ones that would be used for industrial uses. So obviously a restaurant or a factory is going to use a lot more energy than a retail business, that sort of thing. So we've separated those two because it's really difficult to sort of pigeonhole that and separate those two and to define something that's going to encompass everything. I think ultimately that's our goal, but for now we're basically saying, let's make this as good as we can. Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So we're making it a little simpler. And we've seen that trend around the state. For example, Denver basically punted on restaurants and hospitals because that's just too energy intensive to tangle with right now. Another thing is white box projects. So that means basically what's happening at City Market over there. That when City Market was built and approved, there were some empty spaces planned. They didn't know if it was going to be retail or restaurants or whatever. So they couldn't really get to net zero in something like that without knowing what the use was. So we said, all right, let's just focus on that residential, I'm sorry, on the building envelope loads. Okay, next slide, please. So I'll talk basically about the process. There's multiple parts of this. There's the IGCC itself, which has basically similar requirements as LEED, from site sustainability, which covers site selection, development mitigation, heat island effect, light pollution, it ties into transportation, that sort of thing. Chapter 6 deals with water use efficiency. So that's for potable and non-potable water, wanting to be as efficient as possible on the site and for the building itself. And similar to energy efficiency, that's something that is consumed. So we're encouraging water monitoring in that. And all these are detailed in that memo in one of the links that you received. And they'll be posted again at the end of this webinar. So indoor environmental quality, oh, not quite there yet, go back one. Indoor environmental quality, so that's very similar to what's been in LEED for the last 20 years. It's going to be wanting to create a clean and healthy work environment. So not allowing tobacco smoking inside and monitoring the outdoor air delivery, really making sure people are comfortable in there. There's good acoustic control, so it's not too noisy, good quality lighting and daylighting where that's available. And then construct materials and resources. So that's going to be looking at really starting to talk about the embodied energy in a building material. I use the example of marble. We have a marble quarry in this valley. So that's obviously going to have a lot less embodied energy than, say, Italian marble that's shipped, mined and then shipped across the ocean. So starting to look at those kinds of things, minimizing the carbon footprint of the materials, all the materials in the building. And then lastly in this section is really construction and plans for operation. So that includes something very important, which is building commissioning. So building commissioning means, hey, we've designed this great building, and we run energy models, and it gets put in there, and it needs to be tested and calibrated to make sure it works. So building commissioning to make sure that it really lives up to its design goals. So those are the basic things that are in the IGCC that we've amended. Of course, I'm going to dive in a little deeper on Chapter 7, the energy efficiency. That's the chapter that does deal with renewables and electrification. So we'll get back to that. Okay, next slide, please. All right. So renewable requirements. So basically, just to let you know, we're trying to get to that 2030 goal with new construction, which is 100% renewable net zero. So we're not going to start right away with that. We're looking at increasing the requirements every 3 years to meet those goals. And that just seemed reasonable. It dovetails with building code releases and adoption. So you'll see in our roadmap, which we'll show you a little bit later, that how we're accomplishing that. So when you talk about renewables in this climate, photovoltaics or PV are really the way to go to have on-site renewables. I mean, people think it's windy at times, but when you look at it on an annual basis, we have very few wind resources. You've probably all driven through eastern Colorado and seen the big wind farms out there, and that's where it's nice and windy out on those plains, but not right here. So we really use the metric of how much roof area per solar panel and that sort of thing. So that's what we're talking about. One thing we considered is the physical space limitations on site. So you can only fit so much PV on the roof. So that was really important. When we originally adopted a mandatory PV requirement, which was 10% for commercial buildings, we did a lot of studies, or I did a lot of studies to look at how much roof area is taken up, but if we did 10%, and it was all doable, you know, in the downtown area and in other areas. Okay, well, we did the same study basically for commercial buildings and found that 25%, I mean, you know, commercial buildings with 25% renewables. So we found that basically we're able to meet that on site. You've probably all seen, I think it's the A&B Bank or the Roaring Fork Family Physicians Valley View facility over on Euclid. You can see there's a little bit of solar on those, and that's about 10%. And you can see there's also a lot more room for solar. So that's what's been taken into account to create this. We're definitely looking at each site. You know, fortunately in Carbondale, we have great solar access. We don't have Shadow Mountain like up in Aspen or other places, or in Glenwood where there's a shadow a lot of the time of the year, especially in the winter. But if you do have a site that has that situation, you'll be granted some sort of waiver for that. Other thing, we're really encouraging on-site renewables because it's part of the whole mix. I mean, the utility companies are counting on us having a lot of on-site solar. And one reason is the availability of off-site options is very limited. There aren't a lot of solar farms that are going to be right within our jurisdiction, whether it's Holy Cross or Excel within the 81623 zip code or Western Colorado at all. So, and that's a very dynamic situation. So we're tracking that to make sure that's okay. And we want to encourage those when they're available, but if they're not available, then we need to really push for more on-site. And we're gonna, as we get into future requirements, we're looking at that greening of the grid. If the grid becomes 100% renewable by 2030, that's great. We will adjust those requirements as utilities approach that. All right, next slide, please. All right. So what are the 2021 renewable requirements that we're proposing? So we've basically broken it down into two levels of buildings, buildings over 5,000 square feet and buildings under 5,000 square feet. So we're starting out in 2021, requiring 25% on-site annual energy use covered by renewables. And that would be you would need to prove that with energy modeling, which is typically done anyway for any of the larger buildings. And we feel pretty comfortable with that 5,000 square foot number. Buildings under 5,000 square feet, we're looking at 3 watts of PV per square foot as of floor area as a requirement, which is similar to what we're doing for sorry, my slide slipped, residential. So residential, we're looking at 1.5 watts per square foot, which is about that 10% number. So we're looking at increasing that. Off-site, so we start to focus on that off-site renewables question. So it's really only allowed if on-site is not feasible in this current phase. And that needs to be proven by a solar technician to do a site assessment and let the chief building official know. And we really only want those in the local area. And basically, if you are going off-site, we're talking about basically a 50% increase. So 25% being the requirement, getting up to 37.5% if you're going off-site. And that equates to that next less than 5,000 square feet, 4.5 watts per square foot. If none of those options work, and there's no way to do this. You can pay the fee in lieu, which is equates to about $5 per watt equivalent. So that's what you need to pay, and that's the same number we've been using for years. And when you talk to John Pino, the building official, he's we're just not getting a lot of people doing that. Almost everybody's doing the required solar because it makes financial sense. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about the next item, which is building electrification.
Jeff, can I ask you a question about the renewables slide?
Yes.
So can ComCheck provide the needed modeling, or is there a specific modeling tool that you guys are looking for folks to show the projected energy usage? Yeah,
it's beyond ComCheck. So it's really a DOE2, which is Department of Energy 2 program, which has kind of been the base for a lot of the modeling simulations. It's, there's a lot of variations on that, but it's a much more detailed modeling software that all the engineering companies use. And, if you're going to do a larger building, you need to have a lot of inputs, like time of use, function, what's happening inside, what the occupancy is. And those things are just beyond the ComCheck, which is just the simple Department of Energy free online tool where you're just putting in wall areas. You're not really talking about too much about mechanical systems or uses.
Great, thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so any other questions before we move on to this beneficial electrification? Okay, so what is beneficial electrification? It's really a new term that's come out in the last 2 to 3 years. So when we were doing the residential program and upgrading that last year, we were not talking about beneficial electrification. And it's basically reducing the use of fossil fuels in buildings. So gas is the big one. So if we're talking about converting existing buildings or new buildings, rather than having a gas boiler, going to a heat pump system. So that's really what beneficial electrification is about. It's not just turning on your electric baseboard heaters and using electricity instead of gas, because electric baseboard heaters, as anybody knows who's been in a place that had those, they can get pretty pricey as far as your utility bills. So there's a lot of technology that's changing. So basically, how do we get there? How do we get to achieve this strategic or beneficial electrification goal? Well, we require renewables, so that's a big part of it, so that you're using more electricity, but it's coming from renewables. We're looking at phasing in these requirements to get to an ultimate goal. If an ultimate goal by 2030 or 2050 is to be totally off the grid, gas and fossil fuel wise, then how do we get there? Now we're starting out with some exceptions. We're just gonna kind of take it easy. Let's walk before we run on this stuff. So we're looking at including the exceptions for process loads, as I mentioned. So obviously restaurants or a wood shop or anything like that is going to have a bigger load. We're not requiring you cover that with renewables. So when you do that energy modeling, it's really about those loads that are generated by heating and cooling of the building envelope itself. Cooking is a big one, and fireplaces seem to be the ones that pop up for people. So basically include an exception for those in this initial 2021 phase. The technology is developing. This is one reason we're doing this phased in plan. So we're going to be revisiting this every 2 to 3 years and knowing what technology is there and adapting, modifying the code to that. Now, we know that the cold climate heat pumps exist now, so we're able to utilize those. We're doing a lot. Maybe some of you have been to the CLEER webinars on training both contractors and architects and designers and owners about how to use these heat pumps and what's available. So really doing a lot. It's really the buzz nationally and internationally. How are we ramping up to meet this electric ready grid? So electric ready being a big part of it. So even if you're not able to do those things at this time, we want you to design the electrical capacity for future adaptation. So that really means, wiring and panels and that kind of thing that you can add on to later. Electric vehicles are another part of beneficial electrification. We're not talking about those in this code. This is a building code. That's going to be part of the Unified Development Code, including increasing electric vehicle requirements. You've seen, again, City Market, they have a few chargers, and there's a number of chargers around town. And, when I driving around this valley, it's the number of Teslas and electric vehicles is amazing. It's really catching on quick. So that's the gist, that's the skinny behind what beneficial electrification is. Okay, next slide, please. So this just kind of summarizes, this is something great put out by the Southwest Energy Efficiency Project. They're located on the Front Range, but they deal kind of in the Southwest US. And they've really got a good handle. They've got a huge paper they've put out that looks at what are the building code options to get us to this beneficial electrification. So incentives are a big one. So a lot of these we're including in the code. So we're talking about rebates and that sort of thing. And Heidi's going to talk about that in a little bit. Electric ready, as I mentioned, pre-wiring, having that panel capacity. Electric preferred. So basically we're preferring that you do it with electricity. If you don't, then you need to provide some more renewables. Building type specific, we haven't really dove into that yet because of the process load question. So haven't really gone that way. Electric only with exceptions. So that requires electricity for heating and water heating and cooling, obviously, but allowing the gas stoves and cooking, that sort of thing. And then ultimately having that goal, let's say by 2030 of electric only. So no fossil fuels in new construction. So everybody's aware who's in the industry trying to encourage a beneficial electrification that this is new and the technology hasn't always fully caught up with it. So that's why we have this kind of staggered and phased in approach and allow some exceptions, that sort of thing. Okay, next slide will be about, what are we actually proposing for 2021? Well, we're saying it's what is required. So electric ready, as I've mentioned a few times, you're allowed to do gas for space heating and water heating. However, you need to do some additional renewables. And I'll get into those details later. And once again, that gas is allowed for certain uses. So those are kind of the big ones, the renewables and the beneficial electrification. They're a little bit outside the basic list of amendments to the IGCC itself. So the next slide is really the roadmap to 2030. How do we get there? And you can see pre-2021, and then every 3 years up to 2030. So if you look at the commercial renewables, currently we're at 10% renewables on site. And if you do go off site, there's that 50% penalty, which just means 15% renewables. So that's where the code stands today. So now we're proposing 25% renewables, again with that same 50% additional renewables if you're off site. And you can see we basically bump it up 25% every 3 years till we get to that 100% by 2030. One thing, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at what can you fit on buildings. So we're basically saying 25% on the building, no matter what, and then the additional renewables can be off-site. If you do 50% on site, you're able to fit that. And some buildings, frankly, will do 100% on site. It's really the less expensive way to go. And some of the new projects that are proposed for Carbondale are going to be net zero and have all their renewables on site. So it is possible. And then that's where I mentioned we're going to be calculating the renewables mix within the grid. So if the grid becomes 100% renewable, that kind of changes the calculation. But we don't know what that's going to be. I mean, one idea is Catherine Rushton with CLEER and I have been working on is to take those, have a recalculation at the beginning of every year. What's the mix going to be for that year? Anyway, that doesn't affect what we're doing in 2021. It just kind of a heads up a little bit to let you know what's going on or what we're thinking about. So the next level is commercial electrification. So pre-2021, we didn't have any requirements for that. And then 2021, as I showed in a previous slide, natural gas is allowed for process loads without penalty. However, if you're using natural gas for space heating or water heating, you need to provide 25% additional renewables. And again, that kind of moves all the way up to 2030, and it increases the amount of renewables you have if you do use renewables for heating, cooling, or light or water heating. So let's see the next. Then with the ultimate goal in 2030 to being no connection to natural gas infrastructure at all. So, natural gas has been a great bridge fuel in that it's gotten to be a lot cleaner than burning coal. However, we're ready to get to that next level, and that's what this does: more renewables and beneficial electrification. I can go on to incentives. Have any questions come up, Heidi?
Nope, no questions yet.
Okay.
So folks, feel free to chime in with questions or input within reason. There will be opportunities to give input later, but we've got a little time.
Yeah. So incentives are another thing, and this is where we're going to want some feedback from you all. What would motivate you to do a building that goes beyond code? Obviously, money is an important one, so we know about that. Permit fee reductions, speeding up the review process, simplifying the code requirements if you're doing net zero or a LEED building and that sort of thing. So we're definitely looking at some of those. What else? If you have any ideas, we'd love to hear them, of course, because that's really what's important. And we can only speculate. And this, these are some of the things that are happening nationally, but maybe there's something else that we'd like to know. Having lunch with John Plano could be an incentive that has come up, or maybe that's a disincentive. I don't know. So let's go ahead to the next slide and just kind of in summary, really looking at, what are we doing to get there? To get to that climate goal that we've established by 2050. We're looking at net zero construction options, having those mandatory renewable requirements increased and increasing every 3 years, focusing on that beneficial electrification, and then ultimately eliminating natural gas from buildings. Again, the process loads we'll need to address, but at this point, it's we're working toward that. I think Heidi has some slides on some of the utility incentives that she'll share with you all, because there is money out there when you are doing these things, which has been a big help. I mean, there's so much solar on buildings in Carbondale and the Roaring Fork Valley that it's amazing. I did a study a number of years ago while I was working more with CLEER about what did we have 30 years ago, how many renewable, how many kilowatts of PV, and I think it was about 10, and now we're in a much higher number. I don't know what the current number is. Heidi, maybe you do, but it might be a megawatt or something. So it's just been exponential, the amount of renewables that have been installed. And it's partly requirements, and it's partly the cost. The cost has really come down, not only the cost per watt, but then tying that in with local and utility and other incentives that Heidi will share.
Yeah, and Jeff, before we let you go, before you're off the hook, Scott's got a question here that I think he's referring to future iterations of this code, but the question is, will there be an EV or a battery ready requirement?
Yeah, the EV requirement, as I mentioned, is not part of this code right now. It's part of the Unified Development Code, so it's not. We're talking about the building code here. So there is an EV charging, it's electric vehicle charging station requirement.
And do you anticipate batteries making it into the building code at any point?
Yeah, so batteries are important for the utility company and flattening out the peaks. It really doesn't help us meet our climate goals at this point, so we have not included it. We've spent a lot of time on that question. Pitkin County was requiring some battery backup there. They have their own utility company. I'm sorry, Aspen, yeah, and Pitkin County, but they have a smaller utility company. I think ultimately it will happen in a few years, but it really needs to come from the utilities because that's who's really going to benefit from that. Individuals can do it. There are some great rebates and incentives through Holy Cross. I know I'm not as familiar with the Excel ones, but that is an opportunity. It can, it can help you with blackouts or brownouts or things like that.
We've got another question here from Patrick. I'm going to try to unmute Patrick. Patrick, you should be able to unmute yourself and ask a question now.
Great. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Hey, Jeff, thank you. That's a great presentation.
Yep. Thank you, Patrick. Thanks for joining.
The system we're looking at then is a 3-year increment to get where we want to be eventually, yes?
That's correct, yeah.
Right. What happens to buildings that are built now, but they're below the goal that we hope to get? Do they, when, if ever, will they have a chance to upgrade their current heating systems to something we would prefer?
Yeah, so once they're built, they become existing buildings, right? So then we need to address them as we would all existing buildings. What's nice is that we're requiring the increased panel size and that sort of thing so that they can, in the future, add additional renewables or heat pumps, that sort of thing. So that's the way we're approaching it. And as the prices come down for heat pumps and renewables continue on that path as well, then I can see that being part of that existing building program.
So it raises the question that there's a great deal of expense that goes into whatever the current equipment that they're putting in. The lifespan on this current equipment is in the 20-year range.
Right.
You're asking a building owner who may be a different party at that time, maybe a whole group of people as opposed to a developer, to go back now and essentially eliminate all of that original investment and take on a new investment in terms of, for example, heat pump, heating and cooling, right?
Right. Yeah. So what's going to happen? What I see, I was pretty heavily involved in the performance contracting work in Garfield County through CLEER and Garfield Clean Energy. Basically looking at that equipment and looking at how much energy is it using now and what is the cost of that, and then looking at, okay, we've got a point here in 3 years, the lines cross where the cost of the retrofit for the heat pumps has come down enough. Now it is a little bit high, so it's tending, again, trending down. So at that point you go, okay, it's time, we can do that now. We didn't feel comfortable, and I know you on the environmental board and others have said, well, we should just make it, we should be 100% net zero now. Well, we had to balance, the needs of the community and cost and development and come up with a strategy to get us to that 2030 goal. there's a lot we can do with renewable, with existing buildings, and we'll have another discussion about that. I have a lot of ideas, and there's a lot of examples around the country, so I think we should continue that conversation and make that happen.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that it behooves us to think of some kind of a Marshall Plan, if you're familiar with that idea.
Yeah.
Just an all-out push sooner than later. And I know you guys are getting at that with these webinars and things that are going on. We know that buildings, for example, the Ski Code just put one up over at Willits. It's all electric. We know it can be done. And I understand why we're hesitant to make an ultimatum right now, because we're used to a certain process in the development world. But my particular input would be to try and move up those dates as much as possible, because I think ultimately we'll be more successful.
Great, thank you. Good input. Appreciate it. Thanks, Patrick.
Thanks, Patrick.
Any other questions? Okay, great. Take it away, Heidi.
All right, thanks, Jeff. Wanted to take a moment to talk about some of the incentives, tax credits, and rebates to help folks offset some of the costs of these increases in efficiency in the buildings. Luckily, we've got some good utility options in the area. Each one of these, just for the reference, as I mentioned earlier, you will get a follow-up email to this presentation with a PDF of the slides in it. These are live links to the relevant information from each utility here. And I believe those live links should carry over into the document that you get as your follow-up email. But, and we've got Mary Weiner from Holy Cross is here, and Mary, feel free to chime in and correct or add to this. We're running a little shy on time, but we're not quite there yet. But Holy Cross offers a whole building rebate for all electric buildings. There is information in that link to give you some more details about what that involves. They also have lighting and heat pump heating and cooling rebates. There are solar rebates to help you offset the cost of meeting those solar requirements. These rebates are based on the system size. Excel similarly has a new buildings program. It is not just for all electric buildings. It's mixed fuels, since Excel obviously offers both fuels. And it has a couple of different programs based on the size of the building. The larger the building, the more services Excel will offer. That process, CLEER is here to help a design team or a builder support and facilitate that process if you want to apply for that program or just get more information on it. They also have lighting, HVAC. They also have rebates for commercial equipment. That's addressing the process loads that Jeff was referring to earlier when he was clear that the building code is about the building, but acknowledging the energy usage and other commercial processes going on in these buildings. There are also solar rebates based on the system size through Excel as well. And then for Black Hills Energy customers, they have a new buildings program, which is actually new to them, not just for new buildings, but it is a new program. It looks at it does require some energy modeling. I'm not entirely clear what level of modeling, but I think it's going to be that same DOE2 level modeling software that Jeff was referring to earlier. So probably stuff that's already being done in the design process for these buildings anyway. They also have HVAC and commercial equipment rebates through Black Hills. So in addition to the utility rebates, there are some federal tax credits to help you offset the expense of these building projects, as well as some support from CLEER. So for the federal tax credit for the efficient construction, of the building. This is up to $1.80 per square foot based on the lighting and mechanicals. It does require modeling. I've linked here a list of the software tools that are accepted for that federal tax credit for energy modeling. These are likely the same energy modeling software tools that would be used for any of the other hurdles that you need to model for that have been mentioned throughout this through this presentation. And that tax credit, federal tax credit, was developed to be paid toward the builder or developer. Given my experience with the residential version of this tax credit, I would say that it is likely that other entities involved in the design and building could possibly be eligible. You would want to check with your tax professional to find out if you as a partner in this project are eligible, and then look into, is the building compliant? There is also a federal tax credit for solar. It is currently set at 26% of the project costs until the end of 2022. For 2023, it's going to ratchet down to 22%. Basically, as the market gets more saturated, the tax credits ratchet down. It's a common model with lots of efficiency things that are being incentivized through tax credits. And then here at CLEER, we can support your process in a few ways. If you are not participating in a utility program that gives you design review, we can offer those services. Sometimes we are able to bring in subject matter experts from other organizations to join in on those design review meetings. And then we can also facilitate your rebate application process. As soon as you start to develop plans for these buildings, I know specifically the Excel New Buildings program really wants to get involved as early as possible. But at the very beginning, if you reach out to CLEER, contact us through this link here, through the email that you'll get following up, and talk to us about your project, and we will help you make sure that you're taking advantage of every rebate or tax credit that you can, and we can facilitate that application so that you hopefully will have to send stuff to fewer other entities. So hopefully you can send stuff to us and we can help you make that process a little smoother. We've also included here, these are the links that were included in your invite to this meeting. These documents are things that are going to be useful to you as you formulate your thoughts and start to develop some input on this process here. We've linked the actual 2018 IGCC as well as the 2021 to allow you to look forward to what's moving ahead. Some of you guys might have building projects in mind that are pretty long-term and you want to know where things are heading. There are also links to some of the history documents and stuff that Jeff talked about in the beginning provided here. And then lastly, the whole point of this was to inform the public and get their input. So your input is needed, and we look forward to that. We would hope that people could provide input via email by July 7th. You can email us at CLEER. You can reply to the email that will come with these slides following the presentation, or at this email address here. And we have 5 minutes left of our time after our rough start. If anybody has any more questions or very quick input, we've got a couple minutes left just to see if anybody has anything that needs to be heard. And if not, oh, let's see. Fred, did you have a question? Oh, Fred. Let's see. Ah.
Oh.
I see a question. So Scott Mills brought up a question, and he's asking just a little bit about how CLEER is supporting the design process with the Habitat for Humanity project upcoming in Rifle. It's a multifamily project, a little different than commercial, but my role in this process has been to help with the energy efficiency of the envelope and mechanical designs for this project, as well as connecting them with other people who have designed very efficient Habitat Humanity projects in the past. I've worked with Habitat on both coasts and some passive health and super high performance habitat projects. So I've been I've been serving as a consultant to that project. And we've also been able to offer some design load calc observations and some connections with some mechanical equipment supplies. So that kind of service would be available for any upcoming commercial projects too. That might have been our last question. And if anybody has, that's just one example of what our design services are. So if you've got questions about how we could help you and support a process upcoming, feel free to email us and see how we can get involved. And if that's our last question, we're gonna wrap it up for today. And please do email your follow-up, and we look forward to hearing from everybody. Thanks for your time, guys.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.